So my name is Jojo Mehta. I'm co-founder and executive director of Stop Ecocide International. We are a global advocacy organisation, and what we do is essentially we drive the global conversation on ecocide law. And that's what brings this issue into this room today. Legal frameworks for climate and nature-safe investments and the power of criminal law recognising ecocide. So I want to start by just saying that this week has already seen historic developments. Yesterday, in the EU Parliament, voted to proposed ecocide, mass damage and destruction of nature, as a crime to be included in the revised European Crime Directive. That is 4 years after we began this conversation, 4 or 5 years, and at that time, nobody was talking about ecocide law. So this is something that just gives you a little perspective. This is something that is growing incredibly fast. It's moving very fast. So what I'm bringing you today really is almost like a kind of a drop from the future that is kind of having ripples that reach here and are going to be leading within the next 3 to 4 years to the adoption in probably many different domestic legislations, but also potentially at regional and international level, of a criminal law that effectively deters and prevents the worst harms to nature. Why is this important for business? Well, on some levels, it's very obvious, but we do a lot of work, for example, in the UN arena. When we talk about legal frameworks at that level, when we're talking about transition and in the context of climate and ecological crisis, we're talking about agreements like, frameworks like the Paris Agreement, frameworks like the recently agreed Global Biodiversity Framework. But when we look across at the legal frameworks that the business world is having to deal with, those are translated, if you like, into regulatory frameworks and sort of disclosure frameworks like the Task Force on Climate-related disclosures, on nature-related disclosures. There was a talk just earlier today on the CSRD, the sustainability reporting requirements. So all of these kind of what feel like sometimes quite onerous, additional administrative frameworks don't necessarily feel like they have real connectivity to those big frameworks that are being agreed at the UN and that relate to a very real situation in the world, which is that we are facing a crisis that humanity has never faced before in terms of our actual ability to survive and thrive in concert and in harmony with the living world that sustains us. So there's a kind of a bit of a disconnect that is happening there. What there is also is a kind of a rising frustration, and I believe this is being felt from what we've seen, it's being felt from the grassroots level right up to the corridors of the UN via every possible sector, including the business sector in a very broad sense. And that's a kind of frustration, and it's a frustration at the pace of action in response to the level of emergency, effectively, that we're facing. And we need predictability, we need pathways, we need ways to be able to face what it is that we're facing in reality in terms of what is actually a very unsafe world, let alone an unsafe world for investment. And so what we're sort of bringing in here with the ecocide aspect is moving beyond the kind of voluntary side of things when it comes to those bigger issues, such as the climate, the Paris Agreement, the Global Biodiversity Framework, and so on. And the UN Climate Champions, you may have heard of the Race to Zero, which is a group of champions from all these different corporate sectors around the world who've been working on encouraging voluntary action from various sectors in terms of moving through this transition. That group actually acknowledged a few months ago that voluntary action was simply not creating a fast enough transition. It was not creating enough effect quickly enough. And they brought out a report called The Pivot Point back in September last year. And that was acknowledging that policy and regulation are important. That was just acknowledged in the panel before here as well about how regulation can really start shifting things. And ecocide law was mentioned in that report as one of the drivers and influencers of change. Now, that is very interesting because it's not yet in place. And what we aim for in terms of our advocacy work, and we convene at the diplomatic level, we convene with lawyers, we engage with faith leaders, politicians, corporate leaders, NGOs, so many different sectors in terms of broadening this conversation. And what we're looking at is effectively creating a situation whereby everybody can see that this is needed. That effectively what we're needing is an outer boundary that creates a framework within which we can work. Because I think in a lot of corporate sectors, there's this sense that sustainability means reducing emissions. That's the big one. In fact, most of the concentration here has been about reducing emissions. But even if we removed all emissions tomorrow, if we continue to severely destroy nature, we are still going to have a climate crisis, because actually it's at a root cause of the climate and ecological crisis. So there's this sort of focus around emissions, and it's that there's a need effectively to move into how do we actually relate to the fact that the natural systems that sustain us are also being destroyed, and that if we're going to have a safe future, we need to put a boundary, a framework around that. And that is where ecocide law comes in. And it's where the concept of ecocide comes in. Is ecocide a word that everyone in the room has come across, let's say? Just raise a hand if you kind of have an idea what it might mean. Okay, so about half. And I mean, like I say, 4 years ago, if you stopped someone in the street, they would most likely not know what on earth you were talking about. And it's only now that this is starting to become a conversation. But it's this parallel, if you like, of the level of destruction that is happening with those words that have that force, like genocide. So ecocide, effectively the destruction of ecosystems, as genocide is the destruction of a people. So what we aim for is to place ecocide alongside those international crimes, effectively to add ecocide to the list of international crimes, alongside war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity. Not because most people are committing ecocide, most people are not, actually. When we're looking at ecocide, we're looking at the really most serious harms to nature. We're looking at Deepwater Horizon, for example, where safety protocols weren't followed, and had there been a law in place criminalising severe harm to nature, you can bet your bottom dollar they'd have followed those recommendations. One might say the same for the Ohio derailment. I don't know if you've heard about that, where if those railway companies had been aware of a law like this, you can bet that they would not have been using braking systems that were a century old. So those kinds of things. So what we're looking at is a situation where regulations that are in place are not being followed, monitoring it doesn't happen, enforcement is poorly done, and that is effectively a cultural issue. There are practical elements, of course. There are practical elements in terms of the ability to gather evidence and investigate in environmental issues, which may be less simple than a murder case or drug trafficking. But the reality is that where environmental crimes exist, they're actually already as lucrative and as regularly engaged in as drug trafficking. And then when you look at but they're not investigated or reported or prosecuted in the same way. When you look at the regulatory sphere, I gave a talk recently at the Oxford Farming Conference, where we've got the whole of the UK farming industry essentially in a room. And there were people admitting that they didn't always, follow the regulatory frameworks that they're supposed to, because A, they're only fined if they get caught. B, they're never caught because nobody's got the resources to actually pursue that. And yet, at the same time, were there something in place that actually created a level of seriousness around those regulations, that whole environment might be different. So what we're looking at here is the aspect of criminal law that is often forgotten, because when people put crime when you say the word crime, people go down dark alleys with knives, because that's what we associate with that word. What we often forget is that criminal law is there to keep us safe. Criminal law is all about safety, and it's about deterrence and prevention. Murder isn't a crime in order to punish and prosecute murderers, although obviously that's part of what it does. It's there to prevent people being killed. So what we have here in the environmental arena is a kind of a void at the foundational level that should be there, a gap where something should be. So effectively, if you're campaigning for human rights, you know that mass murder, torture, all of these things are serious crimes. In the environmental arena, there is no equivalent. So ecocide as a concept, ecocide as a legal framework can actually create a support for existing regulation and have it taken a lot more seriously. But what it can also do is criminal often is focused, generally speaking, on individuals. So it can create a level of deterrence that is not normally perceived, perhaps, in the environmental regulatory sphere, because generally, if regulations are breached, and an environmental disaster ensues, a company is often just fined. But when you have a criminal law aspect, you have individual responsibility, and effectively it could be the decision makers at the top, and that will potentially then be prosecuted. And that is a very, very different level of deterrence. And it's a level that goes back to the decision-making point. Because again, this is not, the idea of this is absolutely not to have people in the dock and be prosecuted. The point is to create a different culture that has people consider carefully when they're making a decision. If I do my due diligence wrong, if I don't do my environmental impact assessment properly, if I don't investigate my supply chain correctly, and I don't follow those regulations, and what happens is I end up threatening severe, widespread or long-term harm, then what I'm actually looking at is being in the area of criminal law, and that is a very different and much more sobering approach, a sobering concept, if you like. But what I would like to really point out as well is that there is another aspect to this, which actually goes beyond the stick to the sort of carrot side, if we're going to use that very sort of crude metaphor. And I'd like to, if you wouldn't mind popping the definition slide on the screen, that would be great. A couple of years ago, our foundation was approached by politicians who said, could you convene, obviously this is your area of expertise, could you convene a panel to draft a definition of ecocide that could actually be proposed at the International Criminal Court and added to the list of international crimes? Now, there had been working definitions of ecocide, but they were always, a lawyer or a small group of lawyers saying, I think it should look like this, and I think it should mean this, and very disparate. What we did was convene a group of top lawyers from around the world with different backgrounds, some international criminal law, public law, humanitarian law, but also different ideologies. We had people from the International Law Commission, we had former ICC judges, so much more conventional. We also had activist lawyers as well. So it was a real mixture, and it meant they all had to concede something to come up with the definition that you see here. Ecocide means unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there's a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. Now, obviously, there are further paragraphs that define what we mean by widespread, severe, etc. But the core of it is that. And it's so short and so clear that, we had it all printed on the back of our business cards, which is fantastic, particularly when you're dealing with busy politicians, because they don't often have time to go through a 20-page document. But what it also does is it creates, it's actually based on established legal language, but it's also very easy to understand. And when you put this definition into the hands of anyone who knows their sector, and that may be all of you, there's an automatic tendency to use it as a lens. And that really forms a response to the issue I mentioned earlier about people perhaps not being quite knowing what to do to actually move into this transitional space. It's all very well to talk about paper straws or electric vehicles, but actually to look at, what are the things that need to be, what are the steers that need to be put in place if this is going to come into being, which it is well on the way to doing, then being able to look through that definition as a kind of a filter or a lens can really help, and it really stimulates the questions that need to be asked. So if this is coming into place, what about the concrete that we source? What about how we engineer this particular aspect and so on? Have you got a question? No, it's fine, go ahead. You look like you're itching to say something. Mhm. So the way that this has been phrased uses the concept of recklessness. So effectively, it's an idea. It's the combination of an act, and obviously, an act or an omission kind of has to be done on purpose. Otherwise, it's difficult to say that it's criminal. But it has to be done with the knowledge that there's a likelihood of the harm. So that's a kind of recklessness threshold. But it doesn't mean that you had that. I mean, a bit like, if a policeman stops you and says you're not wearing your seatbelt, you're not going to say, "Oh, sorry, Gov, I didn't know I was supposed to wear a seatbelt." It's, ignorance is no excuse. Effectively, if there is public domain knowledge, that would constitute knowledge. I mean, there's many different ways of constituting knowledge, but that would constitute knowledge. And of course, in the environmental sphere now, there is an increasing body of knowledge. And one of the beauties of this definition is that it has a kind of future-proof quality to it, because it doesn't specifically target. This is very deliberate on the part of the panel. It doesn't target any one specific industry, because as soon or specific activity. As soon as you do that, firstly, you make a lot of enemies, but secondly, you also excuse people that are not in the list. So effectively, by predicating it on the level of harm, or the level of threatened harm even, and also on the fact that it either needs to be unlawful, so it needs to be in breach of something already, or it needs to be wanton, disproportionately severe. What you're doing is you're kind of putting, as I say, it's almost like a guardrail. You're putting an outer guardrail in place that can apply into the future, because we don't know what activities are going to be dreamed up between now and 5 years hence. But what we do know is that the level of damage that's being inflicted on ecosystems is unsustainable. So it's about the level of damage, and so it's about sort of creating that filter through which people can look, and also the sort of the ability or the inspiration, actually, and is often the case, to actually look at stimulating innovation. And one of our advisory board gave a talk in Paris a couple of years ago to an auditorium full of CEOs, actually, and she got a standing ovation. And she actually had a couple of people come up to her afterwards in tears, saying, "I am so relieved that this is going to be happening, because I'll be able to go back to my board and say, we can't do it this way anymore, because we're not allowed to." And that is something that is currently missing. And it really created a kind of level of, there's something about a reassurance and actually safety. Like I say, criminal law focuses on safety. And the other point that I just wanted to make, and then I'll take any further questions as well, is that one of the things that got talked about a lot in the previous panel, there was a whole question around consumer information and consumer choice. And there's been a lot of, I mean, to be honest, there's sort of corporate PR has done a fantastic job over the last 20, 25 years of making individual people feel individually responsible for climate change. I'm sure everyone in this room has thought about, what is my carbon footprint? How sustainable is the food I'm eating or the travel I'm using and so on. But in reality, it's not actually an issue of supply and demand. It's not that, we produce this because the consumers asked for it. Effectively, the options that are offered to citizens are not always the healthy options, and those decisions are not made by consumers. In fact, most consumers can't even afford to make those choices. It's a wealthy person's game, being sustainable in your lifestyle. The vast majority of the world can't afford it at all and can't even think about it. So that's why it's so important to put these baseline rules in place that actually have the decision makers at the sort of top of the production chain, effectively, at the start of it, actually shift the way that they're thinking about the decision making, so that there's an additional element. I mean, they're not going to go to a government and say, can I kill 500 people for my new infrastructure project? I mean, it just wouldn't even cross your mind. It'd be criminal, it would be criminally insane. But we don't have the same natural recoil from things that might destroy the environment, because our culture has spent centuries evolving a particular attitude towards the environment. It's a bank of resources that we can use. And it's only now that we're getting the reality check because it's actually bumping up against the finite nature of what we're doing. So putting this in place is very much about recognizing that. And it's about creating a response that is commensurate with the crisis, but it's also about making compliance in so many areas easier. Because when something like this is in place, when that framework is there, it's no longer kind of like a sort of Sisyphus type struggle of pushing something up a hill for every particular kind of voluntary commitment. It simply becomes, that playing field level that was being discussed before, where effectively people have to, those who are out front already want to do these things, but they're disadvantaged. They want to do the right thing, but they're disadvantaged because, finance can continue to flow in the old familiar directions. So it actually creates that, at a really broad foundational scale, creates that fundamental piece that levels the playing field and that supports doing the right thing and makes doing the right thing so much easier. And of course, that not only, interestingly, there's been acknowledgement. So I'm slightly over time, but I just want to flag up that there's been strong acknowledgement from the International Corporate Governance Network, which you may well be aware of, is a big network of asset managers, pension funds, investment funds, and insurers, and so on. And 2 years in a row, they've submitted a report to the climate COP talks, recommending governments to legislate for ecocide. And they just brought out a policy paper with kind of 10 game changers for boards of directors to consider when looking at biodiversity risk. And, ecocide law was second on that list. They're saying to boards of directors, watch this development because it's coming and it's going to be important. And yesterday's approval in the European Parliament shows that this is very much the track that is being followed. And some countries, like Belgium, for example, are already in the process of legislating for ecocide. And it's really only now a matter of time before this moves on to the international level as well. And I ought to just give a little shout out. Apparently there was someone here at the conference from Vanuatu. I haven't actually managed to meet him, but Vanuatu is a small Pacific country. Actually, I like to think of them as a sort of great ocean state, actually, coming from the Pacific. But they're at the sharp end of the climate change and its effects. They're going underwater. They're spending all of their government money just making sure that their population can actually live safely with a roof over its head. That's how serious it is. And they just yesterday achieved a historic victory in the UN, leading a coalition of 133 countries, putting a resolution through to ask for a legal advisory opinion on the state's obligations with regard to climate change. It's the first time ever that a UN resolution has gone through by consensus, as in there wasn't even a vote. And that country, Vanuatu, they galvanized those 132 other countries to stand with them. And we've just met with their foreign minister. They want to work with us. They want to move on to the next stage. From clarifying obligations, they now want to move to the preventive side, and they're going to be working directly with us on doing the same thing for ecocide law. So this is super, super exciting. And literally, this week is absolutely historic. We'll be looking back and seeing it as one of those key moments that moved forward the whole legislative framework that we operate under in our global culture. And I firmly believe that ecocide law will be one of the key legislative developments of this century. You heard it here first. So I've run over time, but if anybody's got any immediate questions, please feel free. Yes, we've got several. Please. Oh, sorry. Someone's bringing you a microphone. Sorry, I'm being asked to wrap up, but obviously we did run over from the other panel a little bit.
Thank you very much. Well, this is the new concept for me. I'm the Minister of Commerce from National Unity Government of Myanmar. We are just in the exile government against the military regime. And then this is my first time hearing this concept. And then I found that, there are some linkages between genocide and ecocide committed by the military, because when the military trying to do against the indigenous people and then other nationalities, well, they also destroy the environment to be settled. So they destroy both livelihood as well as they kill thousands of people. So actually, I would like to explore the linkages between ecocide and then genocide. And then I think I do support the state obligation. And then if my question is it possible to start drafting the national legislation related to ecocide in the global south country like Myanmar as well? Because it will be my area, my ministry area to develop. Thank you very much.
That's amazing, and thank you, Minister. Thank you so much for that question. Yes, absolutely. In many, particularly in the Global South, there is often a closer linkage between genocide and ecocide because of what actually happens on the ground in some of those countries. It can be related to the grabbing of land. It can be related to deforestation and the destruction of communities. It can be related to, for example, I'm thinking of somewhere like the Ogoni Delta in Nigeria. It can be related to pollution of landscapes due to the lack of control of toxic wastes and so on. So yes, there is a strong linkage. And in terms of, there's a slight difference in intent often. So the way that genocide is described is you have to intend to destroy a people. With ecocide, it's not like that. As I say, we've got a recklessness threshold with this definition that has gained a lot of traction internationally. And also, over the course of history, it's not like, somebody's been sitting there stroking their weight cat going, ha, 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 I'm going to destroy the environment. It doesn't work like that. It comes as a kind of tragic consequence of rapid economic development. So, but the linkages are certainly there. And as for national developments, we actually have, let me make sure that I give you my card. We have examples where countries are legislating or in the process of legislating or working out legislation. So if it is of interest to your country, we'd be very keen to support you with the information that you need. Thank you. One more question. Oh, okay.
Hi, my name's Deborah Harford. I'm founder of the Action on Climate Change team in Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. It's interesting you mentioned the Global South because in the North, in Canada, we have extreme destruction of the Indigenous peoples. And in Canada, we are in a very important process of what people are terming reconciliation. Some Indigenous people don't like that term because there can really be no reconciliation. However, ecocide was part of that, what they are now calling genocide, because they knew that the Indigenous people depended on the buffalo, for instance, and so if they killed all of the buffalo, it would decimate the Indigenous people, and sure enough, it did. And many of the species and the landscapes were decimated. I'm wondering if you think that this definition will lead to claims for reparations against governments, such as the Canadian government is, or this is a discussion that is sort of burgeoning. As people say, this ecocide has already happened in so many places with such terrible consequences for the Indigenous people.
Completely understand that. And in a way, I would love to be able to say, yes, they can do that. Now, actually, of course, with criminal law, as with most law, it doesn't work retroactively. So, and so it's not like you could go back and say, oh, you did this 10 years ago and now it's a law, so we're going to prosecute you. It just doesn't work like that. But there's a reason why it's actually quite important that it doesn't work like that, because, and this is quite a nice point to end on, because if we talk, especially if you talk to lawyers, actually, interestingly, they're always focused on, what will happen when the law is in place, who will be prosecuted, who should be scared of being in the dock, how will the prosecutions work, and all of that is valid information that people want. But what sometimes gets missed, and what is so important for the business community, actually, is the space between now, i.e. when you're hearing about this and hopefully educating everybody you know about it, and when it actually comes in. Because that is the space effectively for compliance. That is also the space for innovation. That is the space for, steering in new directions. It's the space for using the definition as a lens and saying, oh, okay, what do we need to address in the next few years, before this actually comes in? Because, of course, in our ideal world, we don't see anybody in the dock. But when it actually comes in, there will, these aspects of sentencing and reparation have not been addressed at the international level yet, but they have been addressed, for example, in this draft that's gone through in the in the EU Parliament about treating ecocide as one of the gravest crimes with commensurate, for each member state, looking at the kind of highest, most severe level of penalties, and that's often a percentage of, if it's a business, it could be a percentage of the turnover, and if it's an individual, it might be a jail sentence or different things like that. So yes, I mean, I hope that sort of answers to some extent, and also shows perhaps why it's, as I say, it's actually quite important that people see this coming before it comes into place, because that's where the strategic window for change happens. And that's really important, because ultimately, when it's a difference, if you like, between the climate litigation type situation that's happening around the world and, cases of negligence and so on, where people are, quite rightly, but they're looking for justice or for compensation. What we're really aiming for here is ongoing protection, is actually changing behaviour so that we still have a healthy planet to live on going into the future. Thank you. And of course, you're very welcome to come and speak to me in the corridor.
Thank you.
Thank you.